Welcome back to Real Clear Radio Hour, brought to you by the Competitive Enterprise Institute. I'm your host, Bill Frezza. For the second half of our show, recognizing National School Choice Week, we have Reshma Singh, Executive Director for the Partnership for Educational Justice, an advocacy organization pursuing common-sense educational reforms designed to empower local communities. Reshma, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me, Bill.
Reshma, I'd like to start by asking you about the name of your organization. Frankly, I'm always a little cautious when activists put modifiers in front of the word justice. What do you mean by educational justice?
It's really a very aspirational name, and what it means is that we hope to partner with a wide variety of individuals, parents, families, and advocates alike to make sure that students have the great schools and great teachers that they deserve, and that those teachers and schools are serving them equally.
So there's a distributional aspect to this, too. Apparently the rich don't have much of a problem getting a good education in our country.
It seems to be the case. It's certainly our lowest income and minority students and families that seem to be subjected to, unfortunately, some of the least ineffective teaching and, as you probably know, the least choice in our system. So middle income and upper income families can either move to another community or pay for private school when they don't like the public education that's being provided to them locally. Unfortunately, that's not the reality for all parents.
No, that's the case. And I understand you started your own career with Teach for America. Tell us a bit about that.
Yep. I went to Teach for America right out of graduate school after attending policy school. And I was there for 8 years and, worked on a number of teams there, mostly in their development function. But I really felt a yearning to be closer to schools and communities. I'm the daughter of 2 educators. There are a lot of educators in my family, but I'd also always known that I didn't want to be in the classroom. And so from Teach for America, I went to Achievement First, which is a charter management organization that runs public charter schools across 3 states and 5 cities. And it was really there while working with parents, across those 5 cities and being responsible for helping to shape a policy environment that was amenable to charter schools and charter school growth that I became really obsessed with that policy and advocacy environment.
And what brought you to the Partnership for Educational Justice?
Again, I think I'm someone who believes deeply in the role that teachers can play in changing a child's life and a child's trajectory. Now research bears this out. Decades of research now shows that the single largest in-school factor that determines a child's success in school is the quality of their teacher.
Of course.
Right.
What else would it be?
Exactly. We can all agree to disagree or agree that there are lots of other factors that influence a child's success. But if we think of the most important in-school factor, it goes without saying that that's the quality and the effectiveness of a teacher.
Well, my mom was a teacher. My sister's a teacher, so I've kind of grown up around it, listening to stories about the classroom. They're both very, very good teachers. But we've had some very heated conversations about tenure. And I understand teacher tenure is a big issue that the Partnership for Educational Justice is working on. Give us some background on tenure. How did it evolve from a protection for the free speech rights of university professors to become the third rail of K through 12 teacher contracts?
Yeah, I think what we've really seen is that a lot of the tenure laws that were passed around the country were passed with really good intentions. I believe the first law was passed in 1908 in New Jersey. And the reasons for that tenure law and other laws around the country were to protect from political hirings and firings, nepotism, forms of discrimination, to help make the workplace and school systems more equitable to minorities and women. And those are all, of course, very noble goals for policies to have. But what we've seen around the country, in California and in New York and in other places, is that what tenure has now provided in some cases is a set of uber due protection or uber due process. And the pendulum seems to have swung to the other side, and in a way that we believe is harmful for kids and thereby violates their constitutional rights.
Since 1908, a raft of labor laws have been passed, making it much harder to do the kinds of things that tenure was designed to protect teachers from, is it still necessary to protect them from those things?
I'm actually not an attorney myself, so I wouldn't make that speculation in every case, but I do think that that's worth a really thorough analysis. The Civil Rights Act was passed.
Mm-hmm.
There are a set of federal legislations around labor for city and state and local workers that are applicable, and I think that's a really good question to ask and to examine. And I think it really depends on the way those laws intersect at the local level.
And certainly teachers have never been subject to the kind of factory conditions that the union workforce in the manufacturing industries had to fix.
No, absolutely. But I mean, I think one thing that you will see that's similar is that we essentially are treating teachers like they're widgets. Like there's a one-size-fits-all approach to their employment, their retention, and their professional development. And I think in sort of an information-driven world, and in the information-driven world that we live in, it doesn't seem like the right set of practices and approaches to manage one of our country's most important workforces.
Well, one of the things I remember reading about are the rubber rooms in New York City. How long does it take and what does it cost taxpayers to replace a single poorly performing teacher under these tenure laws?
So it really depends. It depends on what the charge is that the teacher is found guilty of. There is unfortunately not a lot of recent data. The studies that have been done recently are on a set of teachers, for example, from 1997 to 2007. And a study that Catherine Stevens did in that time range, she found that within that 10-year period, for proceedings that were related to teacher incompetence, those proceedings spanned an average of 830 days and costed an average of $313,000.
$313,000 to fire an incompetent teacher?
Yes. Yeah, in over 2 years of time. And that does not count, for example, all of the months or potentially years of documentation the principal went through to get to the stage of a hearing.
Well, you've indicated that teachers in New York City are more likely to die on the job than be replaced because of poor performance. Is that because New York City is somehow blessed with so many great teachers?
Our data suggests otherwise in terms of student performance. So while only a third of New York City students are reading, writing, or doing math on grade level, 91% of them are considered effective or highly effective.
So Partnership for Educational Justice is taking the legal route to reform. Exactly what New York State statutes are you currently challenging in court?
The families that we support are challenging 3 statutes in specific, and they are New York's tenure provisions, New York's disciplinary proceedings, and New York's seniority provisions. So basically, the tenure provision, the teacher dismissal provisions, and also the policies in New York education law that mandate that teachers are laid off on the basis of their seniority.
Tell us a bit about the families you represent.
Well, we work with a wonderful set of extremely courageous and brave families. We're working with 9 families from around the state, 6 from New York City and 3 from upstate. One of our plaintiffs, in fact, is a 15-year veteran teacher who is suing on behalf of her 15-year-old daughter. And she believes that her daughter is not getting the education that she deserves at Albany Public High School. And it's because she is a veteran teacher that she feels so strongly about the education she feels is not being provided to her child.
Yeah, she's seen it from the inside.
Exactly. She really has a dual perspective on it. Incidentally, we also have another plaintiff from Rochester, Mona Pradier, who's studying to be a teacher and has been, working for nearly 2 decades with children in a school or district setting. And, these are families who care deeply about their kids and would describe themselves as an incredibly pro-teacher, but also believe that based on what they want for their children and the future that they want them to have, that their kids are being denied the education that they deserve.
Just this week, New York Governor Andrew Cuomo made some relatively strong calls for educational reform that seemed to have raised some hackles in the teachers' unions. What's that all about?
Well, I think Governor Cuomo has very courageously decided to side with families and with students around the state. And what he is pointing out is exactly what we've been saying for months, which is that perhaps the pendulum has swung too far in the other direction. And he is now proposing a set of changes to the tenure and teacher dismissal laws that we believe would get us much closer to a place where policies are more kid-centered. That said, the proposal of legislative change is not law.
Mm-hmm.
So it definitely remains to be seen what's going to happen in the next few months.
New York City Mayor Bill de Blasio has clearly lined up on the other side of this issue, fighting against the expansion of charter schools and pretty much carrying the banner of the teachers' union. How successful has he been blunting efforts at reform?
I think he's been incredibly unsuccessful. He's been forced to listen to the demands of thousands, if not tens of thousands, of parents who have consistently protested his anti-reform perspectives. And one would think that expanding choice and making sure that the 99% of his city have great school options would be something that would align with his progressive agenda.
Critics claim that charter schools suck money out of the public education system. How would you respond to that?
Well, I would say that public education and public education resources don't belong to a system. They belong to the parents and families and the taxpayers who are sending their kids to school. And if parents are opting to take those resources to a different public school of their choosing and choice, we should support that.
Give us a few more specifics.
Public education is certainly a public good, and I think that money is not necessarily being drained from a public education system if it's being used in a novel or different way to educate public school kids. That's what I would say that public charter schools are doing. And eventually, charter schools, of course, are run by nonprofits or other organizations, but they're held accountable to public standards. It's just putting the money to use with a different set of structures.
Some time ago, I tracked down and friended my 7th grade English teacher, one of the best teachers I've ever had, on Facebook. And we've gotten into some very lively conversations about charter schools. One of his claims is that charter schools intentionally neglect the handicapped or disciplinary problems and dump those back into the public school system. Does he have a point?
There's inconsistent data on that, to tell you the truth. Obviously, there is some percentage of students that most public schools cannot serve because they require highly specialized settings. But that's a very small percentage of students, and I would say that those students can't be well served even at the public school down the block. There seems to be a central argument that the critics make that is really directed at students that require specialized settings. That said, I think charter schools have made tremendous strides and continue to make tremendous strides to serve kids with special needs, English language learners. I think you see here in New York City, at least, there are charter schools that have populations that really mirror the school district and their district populations of ELLs and kids that require special services. So I really think that the landscape is very varied. And so I don't agree that on the whole that that's a problem.
Well, the issue's become so politicized. The Democratic Party has traditionally come down solidly in the corner of teachers' unions, which remain among the party's biggest financial supporters. I see that former White House Press Secretary Robert Gibbs recently signed up to lead a national PR drive in support of lawsuits challenging teacher tenure. Has a schism opened up in the Democratic Party?
I absolutely believe that there's a schism in the Democratic Party. Education reform is definitely a defining issue for, new and younger Democrats. And I think what we're finding is that there's a real divide in the party. And it's an important divide for us to examine. And I think it's an important divide for Democrats and Democratic leaders to take note of, because I think young Democrats really can't deny the success of educational reforms in a way that is so ideologically driven, the way that you see the Democratic Party of the past.
Speaking of the past, you're probably too young to remember, but do you know what caused the destruction of the world in Woody Allen's Sleeper?
I'm not familiar.
Albert Shanker, the head of the teachers union, got his hands on an atom bomb.
Oh, wow. Hilarious.
Yeah, you got to go listen to that movie again. It's pretty funny, but it does raise a point that there are elements of the teachers unions that are pretty militant. In fact, when I was boning up to talk to you for the show, I stumbled on an organization called the Badass Teachers Association. Any idea what they're all about?
They seem fairly militant based on their attacks of me and us on Twitter. But they definitely seem like a fringe element of the teachers' union that I think the teachers' unions are going to have to come to terms with within their ranks. But I think they are indeed a fringe element of the movement. We're finding that the teachers are actually very supportive of the types of reforms that we're advocating for. And in fact, there was just a recent study out of California where the majority of teachers agreed that tenure requires reform and that tenure was not a meaningful milestone in their career as it currently stood.
And speaking of California, which is often a bellwether of labor laws, there were some recent court rulings out there that related to teacher tenure. Can you fill us in on that?
Yeah, absolutely. And it was actually the groundbreaking and Rivera case that was an inspiration for our own work here in New York. A few months ago, after a 2-year trial, 2-year legal process, Judge True ruled that the state, California's teacher tenure, teacher dismissal, and seniority-based layoff policies were unconstitutional and did violate the constitutional rights of children. And that case is currently on appeal. But I think what the judge found was that the teachers in California had a set of uber protections, uber due process, as he called them, and that kids' rights were being violated, and disproportionately the rights of low-income and minority students were being violated.
There seems to be a very strong call from minority communities, inner-city minority communities, for more charter schools, but the press tends to shy away from those stories. Why do you figure?
You know, that's a really good question. I don't know if I know why the press shies away from those stories. I mean, I think as advocates, we could certainly do a much better job ourselves in highlighting those stories and highlighting the success of students, for example, who attend charter schools and then go on to go to college and graduate from college and are coming back to their communities to try to influence change. So I usually think of that as a shortcoming of our own, of our own movement.
You would think that it would be a major civil rights issue.
For those of us who do the work, it certainly is. We need more of the education establishment and more of our elected officials really answering that call.
Speaking of elected officials, I see that Sheldon Silver, the Speaker of the New York State Assembly for the last 20 years, is in a bit of trouble recently, been arrested for wire fraud and extortion. He seems to have been a significant player blocking educational reform. Do his troubles bode well for where you're heading with this?
It's hard to know. I mean, Albany is definitely a very tricky place. Certainly, I think we're watching that situation very closely. And we certainly hope that, the situation in Albany is not going to hold back the governor and all of the aggressive reforms that he's proposing. But it is certainly a sad situation.
Well, his arrest hasn't slowed him down. He's throwing down the gauntlet, demanding that there's no more room for more charter schools.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm not really sure what to make of that, quite frankly.
Maybe the best defense is a good offense.
Right.
So, Reshma, we focused pretty much on New York in our conversation. What other states are you active in?
Well, so we are in conversations with advocates in a number of other states. I won't disclose those states just yet, but, what we are seeing is a tremendous demand from families and advocates around the country who want to challenge state laws that deny their kids access to great teachers. So, definitely the momentum from the Vergara case in California and ours in New York is the signaling of a national movement.
Well, it was interesting to see what Wisconsin went through with the huge backlash against Governor Walker's reforms, trying to break up the union monopolies. And then quickly in the aftermath, we saw membership, particularly in public service unions and teachers unions, drop like a rock when people got free choice.
Yeah, I think this is really something that the unions are going to have to grapple with. Leadership and membership are not as closely aligned as leaders would have you think. And I think this is a really seminal moment for the teachers unions because, again, as many, I think, recent studies will show or surveys will show, teachers are asking for this reform, for tenure reform, for more feedback, for more tools to measure their effectiveness. Fair tools, but tools nonetheless. And that's a real misalignment that union leadership has with their membership. And you see that in the states where people have the option to opt in, they often
Sure.
don't.
Right to work state have a lot of different economic prospects and I suppose educational prospects as well.
Exactly.
Reshma, assuming success, paint us a picture of what the school of the future looks like.
I think the school of the future could be very exciting. I think what I would envision for our students, and especially in a world that's so increasingly global, is a much more nimble environment for our students. So a school where we have the best quality teachers and that decisions are made on the basis of that quality, and where students, parents, and principals and teachers alike are, aligned on what that quality of teacher effectiveness looks like. But, my picture includes lots of other things too, like more technology in the classrooms, new approaches to teaching difficult and complex subjects, lessons like the Khan Academy features on its website, really raising the bar for our kids.
Do you think we could attract teachers with more life experience, more career experience in other areas if we change the hiring and firing rules?
I think absolutely. We're really working in a very Neolithic context in the education system. And I think some cities like New York City and some other big cities have had some success in attracting mid-career folks. But I think if we truly want to attract, the technology executive who has 20 years of work experience,
semi-retired engineers. Yep.
Yeah. I think we have to make the workforce, the teaching workforce, and our schools a more modern place, a place where competition is healthy and considered vital for success.
Well, I hope so. We sure can't let our inner-city schools keep turning out permanent members of the underclass that have to be supported by government programs. That's not going to work. Reshma, thanks for sharing your thoughts with us today, and good luck with your programs in the months and years ahead.
Thank you so much for your interest, Bill, and we look forward to chatting with you again.
That was Reshma Singh, Executive Director for the Partnership for Educational Justice, here on Real Clear Radio Hour, brought to you by the Competitive Enterprise Institute. I'm your host, Bill Frezza. Real Clear Radio Hour is produced in conjunction with Real Clear Politics, America's premier independent political website. That wraps up our show for this week. We'd like to welcome our newest listeners in San Francisco on KNEW 960 AM and KOSF 103.7 FM HD2, along with our regular listeners in Boston, Detroit, Tucson, Pensacola, and Hayes and Larned, Kansas. Join us next week, same time, same station. See you then.